here in the past, and they tended to be technical, and I sort of evolved my focus from a presentation perspective, from focusing on the technical side of security to focusing on some of the gap areas in terms of where I feel like we're failing as an industry and ways we can improve. So this is one of the talks that I give that is really designed to enlighten you, to explain a little bit about my perspective in terms of how I evolved in terms of my approach to addressing security risk. So it's hunting unicorns and jerks, irrational, defensible, or necessary. And if you need to reach me, here's how you can reach me, and here's how you can not reach me as well. For a long time online, I had an avatar that was actually my real face. My hair was bright orange, I dyed it. And pretty much every presentation I've given over the last 5 years, the first question I've been asked after the presentation has been, Steve, why is your hair not orange? So I'm here to tell you today, my real hair color is brown, and I don't typically have my hair orange anymore. So if you see me online, you may see me with orange hair, but it's really still me. Okay. I'm going to put the slides up on slides here sometime before I get to my flight tonight. A number of other presentations up there too. This gives you an idea of some of the things I've talked about in the past. Well, let's just jump right into things. I wanted to mention too that I'm going to leave time at the end for questions, and if we have enough time, there's a few scenarios I want to work through as a group, so hopefully I'll be able to leave enough time for that. So here's my perception of the current state of information security. Generally speaking, and I'm going to generalize here a lot, key non-IT stakeholders and key IT stakeholders don't really understand security, and that's largely because we haven't done a very good job of explaining it. We regularly scream about vulnerabilities, and we constantly tell the board to patch things and fix things, and this is not how most of risk management and other disciplines behaves. When you think about it, it's not really vulnerabilities that matter to an organization, it's risk. You can have vulnerabilities that have almost no potential for impact or almost no potential for threat. They're not really risk. And a couple of examples I'll give you. I have a really old beat-up car. I generally lock it. If I park it in a parking lot, there's a lot of other nicer cars there. There's not anything of real tangible value inside my car. If I left it unlocked, there's not really much risk, because who's going to want to break into my car where there's nothing visible to take? Who's going to want to steal it when there's hundreds of other cars that are better to steal? On the flip side, let's say I had $1 million worth of diamonds, and I have them in a house in the Sahara Desert. The house was completely unlocked. Well, there's a potential for an impact in that case, so it's the opposite situation. Because if somebody found the house and broke in, there's nothing stopping them from taking the diamonds. However, who's going to go trusting around the Sahara Desert looking for a house that's unlocked with diamonds in it? So the threat is very unlikely. So in one case, you have an impact that's high and a threat that's unlikely. In other cases, flip-flop, but the risk is rather low. So we need to bring more context to the as we look at how we describe risk in the information security field. We also generally don't talk about business impacts and business value. So we're talking about vulnerabilities or risks, and the organization has a hard time understanding how it really ties to selling more widgets or making more profit, and what the likelihood that this particular risk will materialize, or whether it's worth investing the money and resources into mitigating that risk. Because of this, we generally don't have a seat at the table, so we're viewed as the people that are always screaming about something that's unlikely, kept in the corner, because no one wants to talk to us. And therefore, the business and our key stakeholders don't have a very holistic view of the risk that the organization faces from a security perspective. In a lot of cases, we don't either as security practitioners. Because of this, we often lack credibility. Okay, so this is how a lot of folks view us and how we practice information security. They see it as black magic or voodoo. There's a number of ways that you can try to address or identify risk. You can look at your service providers and just go with the tools that they're asking they're trying to sell you, and hope that the tools they're trying to sell you are going to address the risks that exist in your environment. You can go with a compliance-based approach, such as HIPAA or FERPA or PCI, and assume that if you address all the controls that are required, that your risk is going to be low. You can also take a knee-jerk approach. And some of us have experienced that over the last year with heart bleed and shell shock. Those things happen. They have really cool acronyms and logos. Your CEO, your CFO read about it in the paper, saw it on the news, and said, fix this shell shock thing, and so you scrambled to fix it, which meant you dropped everything else that you were working on. It's very disruptive to you and the rest of the organization. That's not a very good way to address information security. So what are some other ways you can identify risk? Well, one of the ways I'm going to share is simply doing threat modeling. And the approach I'm going to take during this conversation is to talk about what I call unicorn scenarios and jerk scenarios, and I'll explain those a little bit momentarily. But I guess I should put back a little bit and talk about what I'm hoping to accomplish during this conversation. And that's really to expose you to a threat-centric mindset. And again, I'm generalizing. I know some of the people in this room already exhibit and embrace that threat-centric mindset, but not everybody does. I'm going to talk about how to leverage jerks and unicorns, and how we can take this information and pump it into a risk register, and how we can consume the risk register to get a more holistic feel for the risk across our environment, and how we can prioritize. And then I'm going to talk about what I call pivoting, which is essentially taking risk scenarios that you've already thought about, and threat modeling you've already performed, and looking at it in a little bit different way. And then I'm going to leave time for questions, and hopefully a couple of risk scenarios that I'm not going to walk through in detail. So what is a unicorn? It's simply a threat that is unlikely to materialize. Either it's really unlikely to materialize, or your perception is that it's unlikely to materialize. And I differentiate the former from the latter because in some cases, organizations believe things like, wow, despite the fact that I have 50,000 employees here, I trust all my employees. And though this can happen somewhere else, and I've heard of it happening somewhere else, this unicorn wouldn't happen in my organization. And the second category is what I call jerks. And if you don't know this guy, I think I got a lot of notoriety about a week ago when he took a drug that had already been bumped up from $1 per pill to $13.50. And he decided he was going to raise it incrementally, immediately to $700 per pill. So he got interviewed by a lot of media. He was rather smug, and he said, no, I'm going to keep it this high price. So it was a drug that was originally at $1 per pill. We had about $300,000 per year market in terms of revenue. And he was trying to turn it into about a $200 million per year product. I think he backtracked a little bit. I thought from a contemporary perspective, he's very representative of what a jerk is. So a jerk is a threat that's intended to cause harm. Now, it can also be a unicorn, so they're not mutually exclusive. But this is a threat that's not really designed directly to cause benefit to the attacker. It's designed to cause harm to the individual organization that's being targeted. So, first scenario I want to go through is laptop theft. So we all know about laptop thieves. They look something like this. They have a mask. They wear gloves. They probably wear blue jeans. Oh, and they also sometimes wear the necktie with no gloves, but still have the mask. Sometimes they don't have the gloves, but you see they have to have a mask. Sometimes they have a wedding band and a really strange-looking grin, really very risky. So we all know what these threat actors look like. Easy to identify, right? Unfortunately, sometimes they don't look like that. Sometimes it's people that just in broad daylight saw a car that they see something in, decide to break the window and make off during the middle of the day with the laptop inside. Other times, it could just simply be a laptop left unattended in a coffee shop. But perhaps somebody went to the bathroom, because they come back rather quickly, and hopefully the people next to us watch it, and somebody just walks up and leaves. Maybe those people were even actually watching it, but this person is brazen and just decides he or she is going to take it and run off. The people that are watching are probably not going to get a chase. The laptop is now gone. Okay. So in this scenario, we tend to, as organizations, have a number of basic controls. We have policy that says something like, Be careful where you use your laptop, because it could potentially get taken. Then we'll have security awareness that maybe describes some of the places that you should or should not use your laptop. Be careful when using it in an airport or in places with other people. Do not leave it unattended. You may even have an organization, this is not very common now, that issues a cable lock and says, lock it down to something pretty secure. Now, you could actually say that's policy, and you could have security awareness and issue a lock, but it's unlikely people are actually going to do that because of the friction involved. It's difficult. You don't think people are going to take it, so you leave it there for 30 seconds and it's gone. Plus, it's embarrassing to have a cable lock. Right? You go to Starbucks or somewhere else, everyone has their laptops without cable locks, so you don't want to be the only one with a cable lock. So we have things in place like screen lock, so that the laptop is inactive for some period of time, generally 5 to 30 minutes, it'll lock, and that's great if somebody decides they're not going to take it until the device actually locks. You have full disk encryption, so if the device is turned off, hopefully no one can get into the device. That said, it's probably the same password as the enterprise password, so if you use an enterprise password via phishing attack or other means, or the person uses the same password for the enterprise they use on their Gmail account, it really starts to break down the efficacy of these controls. You may have multi-factor authentication, which is fantastic if the hard token is not left with the laptop. And so there's a lot of potential flaws when you start to extract the layers of the onion. And interestingly, we make things a little bit more risky by trying to make things more useful. So when we think about things now, we generally have network storage and tell people not to leave their sensitive data on a local device, which is really good. However, we often have this in place with a VPN. The VPN might either always be on or may have the same credentials that are used to both get into the operating system and also to get past the encryption, which means that it may be trivial to gain access to the internal network to get access to that sensitive data in those sensitive systems. And that's just the reality of the current environment. So when we put these controls in place, the environment evolves, and we need to ensure that our controls evolve, otherwise we're potentially left with controls that are not as effective as we thought they were. Okay, but you might be saying, Steve, that's not really a unicorn. We have computers taken all the time. Well, let's look at the picture again a little bit different way. And there's really 3 different computers in this picture that could be targeted. We were talking about the one that was unattended, but pretend that one's not there. Instead, I might actually target the one that's being used by the female. Now, there's not really any difference unless it's a targeted attack, and I know something about the female and her organization and her level of access versus the male, but I do observe that she has a cup of coffee that's kind of between her and the computer, so if I went and grabbed her computer and ran off with it, it's probably less likely that she's going to be able to easily get up without knocking the hot coffee over on herself and give chase. So if I wanted to, I could potentially target somebody whose computer is logged in and potentially connected to the external network. So now this is the unicorn scenario. This is something that most organizations, 1, haven't thought of, and 2, don't have controls for. So I wanted to poll the group, and I'm going to ask this question in 3 ways, because I know most of the time people aren't going to raise their hand. So the third part of the question, the third answer is going to be that you're just completely unwilling to answer my question, in which case you're not raising your hand. So question is, in your organization, do you have a mitigation plan in effect to address the scenario of somebody stealing a laptop that's logged in and being used? Raise your hand if you do. Okay. Now, raise your hand if you don't and you're willing to share that. Okay. So, I'm going to say that maybe 15% of the room has a mitigating plan in place, which actually is really exciting. And maybe 40% of the room doesn't, and the rest are just not willing to share or not paying attention at all, which is fine. So I was actually surprised that it's that high, but it is indicative of the fact that a high percentage of your organizations have not considered this risk scenario. And in terms of risk It's probably not the most likely for the average environment because there's much easier ways to gain access to a system. However, when you start to peel back the layers of that and think about how this could happen, it may not be somebody who's trying to gain access to your systems or your data. It could simply be somebody who's trying to get a free computer, either for their use or so they can sell it. Now data breach notification comes into play, you have to scramble to figure out how you're going to respond. You might potentially have to do a very broad data breach notification. It could cost you a lot of money in channeling resources in a way that you would prefer not have to channel them, when in effect the attacker or threat actor was not actually trying to gain access to your data. Okay. And if you think this doesn't ever happen, here's an example of a case where it did. This is an individual who was allegedly identified as a Dread Pirate Roberts who ran the Silk Road marketplace. If you're not familiar with how he was caught, FBI did a very intense investigation. He had brought his laptop to a library in San Francisco, and they pretended to have a domestic dispute between a male and female FBI agent very close in proximity to him, which caused him to be distracted. And while he was looking to see what was happening, one of the FBI agents grabbed his laptop and pushed it towards another FBI agent who then now had physical possession of it. The reason they did that was they were afraid that if they tried to get control of him, he may have the opportunity to lock the device or do something destructive, which meant they would not have access to evidence which would have demonstrated they believed he was who they were targeting, and that there was evidence to demonstrate and build a case against them. And so I had an opportunity a few months after that to ask an FBI agent if they had any recommendations for controls we could put in place, not because we were committing crime, but because we might find ourselves in a similar situation where somebody was trying to take our device. And the FBI agent kind of beat around the bush and chose not to answer the question, which I found pretty enlightening. Would have thought that because they had used this tactic, they might have some advice for organizations they were trying to share this information with, but they didn't. But we get to talk about that right now. And there are other cases where this does happen. It obviously happens a lot for organizations where there's no indication that the individual is trying to gain access to the system or data, or the organization doesn't have enough controls in place to identify what that individual actually did, so they don't actually really know. So, this is a bit of a disaster for a lot of organizations since they don't have these mitigating controls. So in terms of a risk register, if you don't have one right now, this is not really a full-blown risk register, but we simply took this one sentence and added it to a document and wrote down, a person can steal a company laptop from a user who is actively using it and had no other attributes or metadata around it. Wow, you're winning because you're doing way better than most organizations that have no risk register. So you can say right now, well, Steve, that's not a risk register because we should have other information. I'll get into what that other information should be. But you were doing better than most organizations, and this is very easy to do. So if we look back and think that most of you don't have controls for this, it probably also means that you haven't documented this as a risk, and you probably haven't shared that with your stakeholders. Which means that if this does happen, it's got to look like you're going to have much credibility. So on the one hand, it could look like you're Chicken Little and you're saying that sky's falling. I'm not saying that you should run to your steering committee or your executives or your board and say, hey, someone can steal one of our laptops and get access to our data, because they're probably going to say, so what? Don't we have hundreds of other risks and aren't those higher priority? And then you're going to scuffle back to your corner in the basement with your tail between your legs, because the reality is that that's true. So you need to really be cautious about what you use this information for. But at least internally, it's a good idea to start documenting this kind of information in the risk register. So you know your company has no effective controls to mitigate it, but now you've given it some thought, and there's some things that you can do. So let's talk about what those things are that you can do. But I'm going to build on this first a little bit. Probably more accurately, you're going to capture some additional information by trying to at least provide a lens around what you consider the risk to be with this scenario. And risk is a very hard thing to capture. A lot of people and organizations try to do it using a quantifiable method. The nature of the risk is that's what most people prefer to do. It's not really the best way to do it. I'm not here to talk about really the best way or the worst way. This is just a common approach. So let's say that you had an impact scale of 1 to 10. You decided, well, this is pretty high impact because I don't know if it's going to be the janitor's laptop that's targeted or the CFO's. And so because I don't know, I'm just going to err on the side of caution and say it's a pretty high impact scenario. And we're going to use the typical likelihood scale of 1 to 50. That's what most organizations use, right? 1 to 50. So I'm using 1 to 50 and saying it's not very likely, because the reality is we haven't experienced it in our organization that we know of. We think that there's other easier attack scenarios that are probably going to be exploited. So it's not something we're particularly concerned about. And so then we take our normal risk calculation algorithm, which is your likelihood times the square of your impact. I mean, this is the proven way for coming up with a score for risk. And it spits out a score of 107.296 because you need that level of precision when you're calculating risk. It's very important. So, but we don't have any context here. We haven't looked at other risks, so we don't really know where that fits in. But we'll come back to that later. All right. So here's what we've done so far. We've identified a risk scenario. We've put it in a repository that's being maintained by security. Haven't shared it with anyone else, but at least we can sit in our conference room and we can talk about risk. All right. So this says a little something about best practices. So I'm not a big fan of best practices. I like to use the term common practices, and common practices may or may not be effective. It's not really relevant whether they're best. The best really depends on the context, but hey, this Dilbert cartoon teaches us a little something about best practices. So one option, one approach you can take to addressing this risk scenario is to use best practices. Well, I can tell you, I've actually looked. And I've looked at a lot of places. There aren't a lot of best practices written down in terms of this particular risk scenario. So good luck finding them. You may find some, but if people ask you, what are the best practices? There's not really a lot out there in terms of this risk scenario. So you can't follow best practices. If you talk to your security service providers and say, hey, do you have a Blinky light appliance for this? You probably don't have one directly that's going to address this. If they talk about CNMI maturity models, they're not probably going to identify this as a risk. They could talk to you about maturity around having policies and security awareness and having risk registers and looking for risk, but they're never going to have anything, most likely, that's specifically going to call out this risk. And these are approaches that most organizations look at. They say, what's best practice? What does an analyst firm like Gartner say? What do the security service providers that we buy our tools and professional services from say? And what are other organizations like us doing? Well, the reality is, other organizations like you might be doing nothing, right? So if those are the only lenses you use, you can pat yourself on the back and say, well, our mistake, I guess it really wasn't a risk. But we all know that not to be true. So a different approach is to use threat modeling. Okay. And just to give us a little bit of grounding, I want to use this as a compass. It's sort of my mental model for what risk means to me. And it's really not just security risk, it's any kind of risk. And I like to use this kind of terminology because it resonates pretty well with business stakeholders. When you don't talk to them about things like 0 days and malware, they may or may not know what those are, but they understand things like threats and impacts and business goals and terminology like that. So to me, risk is the likelihood of a threat actor showing up, deciding they're going to target you, your organization in some way, using an attack vector or threat method. It depends on what organization or person you're talking to. You might have to adjust your terminology accordingly. That exploits a vulnerability to defeat or bypass whatever controls you have in place, which might be some or none, and causes a technical impact resulting in a business impact with a certain severity. And I purposely mentioned both technical impacts and business impacts because you can have a technical impact that the business won't care about because there is no business impact. And so think about vulnerabilities, right? And so you run a report that says there's machines that need to be patched. Well, a machine that's not on the intranet, not on the network at all, it's just a standalone machine being used for archival purposes. It's fired up once a year to run a report. It's probably not the most critical thing to patch from a business perspective. And if somebody that's a stakeholder on the business side said, so what? So what? What if I don't patch? You have a hard time explaining what the business impact would be. You can say, well, it's a vulnerability, so if you don't patch, there's a risk. But the reality is, the risk is very low, so you need to have some level of context. So when I'm doing threat modeling, I like to have this level of context. In this particular talk, I don't talk much about likelihood, because likelihood is very subjective. And this is really about identifying particular threat scenarios. And when you talk to your stakeholders, you can argue and debate and have a constructive conversation all day long about the likelihood. And that's fine, because you might feel that something is extremely likely. They might feel like it's not likely at all. And because of that, it might not get prioritized and it might not get resources. I sleep well at night when I have those conversations and I'm informing the right stakeholders. And if a choice is made not to prioritize something and not to come up with a mitigation plan and allocate resources, if something bad happens, I can unravel my risk register scroll that has hundreds of risks on it and go, and number 287 on the list, remember we decided not to allocate any resources, and I concurred with that decision because we only have resources to address numbers 1 through 50. Well, this bad thing happened, and it's happened a lot recently. And I think if we reassess it, it might be a higher risk now, and it now allows you to have that conversation and build credibility. Okay. So when I do threat modeling, and I'm not going to get into formal technical threat modeling here, I do that in some other conversations, but I think about things like, how can I reduce risk? And it's not just eliminating vulnerabilities. I think in terms like, to what degree can I reduce the likelihood of the threat actor targeting me, or targeting the system, or the data? How can I reduce the likelihood of that attack vector being successful? How can I reduce the likelihood and the impact of whatever subsequent actions occur? So, if the person stole the laptop and gained access, that's really not a risk because there hasn't been an impact yet. There's only impact when we do something that we don't want them to do. If they just sit there and look at the screen, there is no impact. When they start exfiltrating data, or using a tool to drop your passwords and dump your passwords from the hashes, and use that to do pivot attacks in the rest of your environment, now we're getting into real business impacts and real risks. So then we can think in terms of prevention, detection, and response. There's sort of been a big shift in information security around preventing to moving more into detecting, with the theory being that bad things are going to happen. You just have to accept that they're going to happen, and so it's all about how quickly we can detect them and respond with appropriate response plans. I buy into that some, but not entirely. I like to think of it in terms of the threats, and in terms of impacts. And there's things that you can do to mitigate impacts that don't necessarily mean that you have to detect and respond accordingly. And you'll see when we start to talk about the last scenario that we went over. Yeah. So when we look at potential controls for that scenario, we can potentially reduce the likelihood of being targeted or for the attack being successful. So if you remember in the picture, there were a couple of people sitting there, and one had coffee in front of her, but they're both kind of sitting out in the open. You set yourself down with your back against the wall, and you're very observant of what's happening around you. It's sort of like the situation of if a bear's chasing you in the woods, you want to be faster than the other guy. Well, there were two laptops. I think they were probably identical laptops, or at least that looked that way. So if you're not being targeted, if this is an opportunistic attack, if you simply make yourself less of a target than other people around you, you've done a lot of good. So that can be addressed to a degree by policy and security awareness, but it has to be real security awareness, not the kind of security awareness that's once a year and it's a 10-minute computer-based training. It has to be something that's effective and resonates with people, which means you have to make it personal. And you also need to measure to what degree people understand that there is a risk, and understand the behavior that they should or should not exhibit, both before and after you do security awareness training. It doesn't sound like rocket science, but most organizations don't do that. They just slap together some security awareness, they cross that off the list, and then check that box, and assume that the magic is going to happen. You can also do things that are really extreme, and I just start to throw these out here because when you brainstorm, I think it's important not to limit yourself to things that you think are reasonable, and not to only think about the things that are the tools in your environment or things that you've heard of. So you could do something like chain the laptop to somebody's arm. It'd be a whole lot harder to steal it. You could put the cable lock in place, but we already know that's not very useful. It's pretty high friction, so you should think about things that are a lot less friction. So let's talk about what some of those are. First, in terms of reducing the impact, there are some things, and I've actually talked to some people at DerbyCon, besides myself, that are doing some of these. So proximity-based auto logout. I use a device that, two different ways. I have software on my phone coupled to Bluetooth, so that if my phone is more than a certain range away from my laptop, it automatically locks my laptop. On a different device, I actually have another device that operates via Bluetooth, but it's just a fob that goes on my keychain, and it works under the same principle. That one actually both logs me out when I'm more than a certain range away, and then logs me back in if I'm within a certain range. That has an additional nice feature in that it makes it something that users would want to use, because people hate logging in. Yes, there's some risk with that approach, but we're not working in a theoretical environment, we're working in the real world. So when you put controls in place, it's important to design controls that will actually be effective, and then validate that they're as effective as you think they are. If they're not, it's probably trying to go back to the drawing board. So in this case, if somebody was simply stealing my laptop and they only wanted the laptop, fantastic, they have a laptop, my phone keys are in my pocket, and they're not going to get access to my data unless there's other vulnerabilities that they can exploit. If they're targeting me and they do that, they might demand my keys with my fob or my phone, or if I left those out there, they might just grab them and take them. So they're not controls that are magic bullets. They have to be utilized effectively. You can also do things like a dead man switch. And so this is something where if you don't do something on the laptop periodically, it will take some kind of action. It might block the device, it might wipe the device, it might phone home. It doesn't really matter what it is. We talk about what happens as a result of some of these things, because one is the trigger and two is what actually happens in terms of action you want to take. You can have data apps and files, so think about on your desktop. If the person was trying to get access to your environment or access to your sensitive data, if you had a file sitting there, it was passwords.xls, or an icon that said it was the VPN, you know it's not really the icon for the VPN, and you know it's not really your password file, but they don't, and so it entices them to potentially click those, and then you can have it take some kind of action, like wipe the device, lock the device, take a picture of them with the camera. The possibilities are limitless. The point is that if you decide not to implement the control with the auto lockout, or if that fails, this is an additional control that allows some kind of response to be put in place. There's a big movement in our universe with behavioral analysis, with big data and EPTs. Behavioral analysis doesn't have to be something fancy though. If you think about your users, most of them probably do very specific things. I know normally in my workplace, one of the first things I do is get on an email client, perform certain activities, and then move on. Well, an attacker is not going to behave the same way. So if you had some very basic information about your users and how they behave, it should be fairly trivial to determine that somebody is doing something anomalous, and they may not be the person who actually is assigned to that device. So this is just an example of some of the things that you could potentially do. And they're not without their trade-offs. I'm really not trying to tell you what the solution is. I'm just trying to explain to you my thought process or how I look at these kinds of risks. Okay. So now, if I was really going to put this into a risk register and look something more like this, so I probably would actually have each risk on its own row. So if you look down the rows, it would be a list of risks. So in this particular case, I already had 336 risks in my risk register. Added this one was ranked number 13, which again was ranked pretty high. And I came up with this mitigation plan, which was the plan that as a starting point I wanted to talk over with my stakeholders. And my belief was that if I implemented this plan, it would reduce the risk from 107.296 to 5.434, which is a pretty substantial drop. And so if I was having a conversation with my stakeholders, this is how I'd open up the conversation. You talk about what the existing risk is and how I thought we could reduce the risk. So you might think that the risk scoring is silly, and in a way it is. The reality is you don't need to get it perfect. What you're really going for is this risk 13 out of 337 or risk 350 out 330 out of 337? It's really relative. It's really relative to one another. It doesn't have to be perfect. You want the ones that belong near the top to be near the top, the ones that belong near the bottom to be near the bottom. When you talk to your stakeholders, they're going to have a different position on it, and you can make adjustments. And you can repeat this process on and on. So if we went and mitigated this risk and thought about it, there's still residual risk we haven't mitigated. And at some point, you probably would want to circle back around and identify what the residual risk is and whether these controls were effective. Okay. So now, as hunting and registry value proposition process, we've now added some additional value to the process and expanded its role within the environment. But if we think about something that happens more realistically or frequently in our environment, and we probably don't even know about it, it's an unattended laptop within our environment that somebody curious comes across, or potentially somebody malicious. So it's not somebody running away with it in Starbucks. It's in your office complex. I went to the bathroom, left my laptop unattended. It's a 15-minute inactivity lockout. I forgot to hit Windows L to lock it. 14 minutes or less, somebody comes by and gets on the computer. Who knows what they're going to do? Maybe they want to see what the performance review is that I assigned to them. Maybe they want to send out an email that's nasty on my behalf. They can do a lot of things. They can see some data I want to see. But if we think about that unicorn case, and then look at this case, there are some overlaps, and we could use a lot of the same controls. So by thinking about unicorn, I actually expanded my mind in terms of what controls are for a scenario that's more common in the environment. And also allowed me to think about it and say, you know what, inactivity somehow is not all that effective. I mean, it's good to have, but the reality is it's only really of value if somebody comes across the device after that amount of time has elapsed. I wouldn't want to put all my eggs into that basket. And here are just some of the additional things that you could potentially do if you detected that the device was left unattended. It was now potentially being accessed by somebody that was not an authorized user. And so I could assign this to the risk register as well. So in this case, I ran through the algorithm, assigned this score, and it was much lower on the risk ranking level. So it's not as high priority, but I still had a risk mitigation plan and had some of the similar controls. So if I try to solve the one risk that we talked about before, I can also potentially mitigate this risk with some of those same controls. So when we talk about enterprise risk architecture or enterprise security architecture, you can start to put the pieces together, design architectures from an enterprise and solutions perspective that have some synergies. And again, that's not really the end of it. You should be looking at this periodically, asking these kind of what, how, what if type questions to understand whether the level of efficacy is where you want it or expect it to be, and whether there are other things within your environment that you could potentially address with the same types of controls. And the last bullet is very important. It's important to anticipate friction. Otherwise, we end up in those cases where we spend $30 on a cable lock, buy one for each of our employees, and they just sit there and gather dust and they laugh at us because they feel like we have a total disconnect to how the organization operates. So I say crypto locker here, but in this case, I'm really talking about any kind of Trojan ransomware that can enumerate files on the local device device or network storage and do bad things like encrypt it and try to get you to data ransom. At one point, I would say this was a unicorn, if we go back 3 years or so. Now you would probably say it isn't. And you probably have at least some controls now to hopefully detect that this is going to occur, or at least have effective backup and recovery processes so that you can roll things back, have some idea how long that will take and what level of effort there is, and what kind of files you would not be able to recover because they were modified more recently than you had backups for. But if we think about this, and now we realize, okay, we put some controls in place, so this was on our risk register, we put in a mitigation plan, and we addressed it, what else could occur? And so now we're going to get into a jerk scenario. So what if instead of trying to generate revenue by installing ransomware, the threat actor just wants to cause you a lot of pain? So what they decide to do is install a script, or maybe even manually run a script or some code, that just finds files on local storage and on the network and makes small changes to it. Goes into Excel spreadsheets, changes 100 to 105, changes a formula, makes other modifications in such a way that it's unlikely that it will be quickly detected. In fact, in some cases, it might not be detected at all. So it could be a competitor that's making changes to the information you have about where you want to open up stores, what business segments you want to expand into. So the things that you might want to do in 5 or 10 years from now, you might be making completely incorrect strategic decisions as an organization based on information you don't know is correct. It's the kind of thing that you probably want to have some visibility into. So it's a jerk scenario, but there's ways to address it. So one of the things you should probably look at is, wow, if it's going to be 3 years before you notice that a change was made, how would you notice that change? If there were thousands of files that were modified over a 1 hour span, how would you detect that and what would you do? And so there's ways that can be done. One of the approaches that I like to take is to bait the attacker by putting files onto the system that have no real value to individuals within your organization. And it can contain contents that look like PII, sensitive marketing information. If you place it in the right place, because you know that most of these scripts are going to enumerate alphabetically, where you put these files deep within the file structure, then they're put in places that no normal user would normally interact with. So if you had either enterprise-wide file auditing or at least file auditing on these particular files, it'd be an early warning system that something bad is happening with your environment, and you can start looking to see where these things are occurring and what else is being affected, and then you can hopefully contain and respond accordingly. You can also do behavioral analysis because if you know that most Excel files, for example, a person is not going to open them up and 3 seconds later make a modification and save the file, and they're probably not going to access 10 files within 30 seconds. And so these are the kinds of things that hurt your credibility when these bad things happen, because the organization looks at you and says, boy, Steve, you're a real idiot, because it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that a normal user wouldn't do these kinds of things. How can we spend $1 million on this blinky-like technology to encrypt all our PII, or to tell us that there's an APT in our environment and you can't even tell us that files are being modified? And those stakeholders really do have a point. So in this particular case, this is the number 3 item on the risk register. So this is the kind of thing I'd actually talk to a stakeholder about because it's a pretty high risk. Let's get through some stuff. Right. Back up 1 minute. Just say, so if I was talking to my stakeholders, I might have 339 records on the risk register. I'm probably only going to get 5, 10, 15, 20 to actually share with them. Because if you haven't talked to them at all, there's no point in sharing all 339. It needs to be pretty manageable. So I would start with the ones on the top and see what kind of traction you get. So in terms of a holistic view of how you can use this approach and this information, I would want to have some kind of idea of where I should be looking for threats and unicorns and jerks. I can just sit in the room and make them up, but you can look at the news, You can see what happened with the case that I was just talking about with the marketplace. You can look at crypto locker. You can look at other things that are happening within your industry. You can talk to your peers. You can look at white papers. You can talk to your security services providers. It doesn't really matter. You can sit in a room, eat pizza, and talk with the other people on your team. You can talk to parts of the business and ask them, what are some things you've heard and what are some things you're concerned about? You'll start to get a very good, broad, and deep insight into the kinds of threat scenarios you might want to think about. And if nothing else, you can put them in the parking lots, put them on the list, you don't have to do anything with them. These are things that you'll think about at some future point. Now, in terms of consuming them, if you're building out security awareness, these are the kind of things that should be piping into your security awareness program, because these are emerging threats that you want to address. We need to start trying to adjust the behavior of the workplace. From a vulnerability, threat management, and monitoring perspective, these kind of threat scenarios are going to result in vulnerabilities you're going to want to identify and remediate, report out, threats you're going to want to identify and report out, and monitoring that you're going to want to do. So you really need to not operate in silos. You need to push or have this information pool, and it should fit into your architecture and your roadmaps and your strategic plan. And to some degree, you should be able to measure the efficacy of it. It's not really important if you're getting started to figure out how to do that, but as you get more maturity and more experience, you probably want to be able to say, of the risks that are identified in the risk register, what percentage of them are owned by the business, what percentage of them have a mitigating plan, what percentage of them are on the roadmap to the future, that kind of thing. To what degree are you seeing incidents that are mapped back to items in the risk register versus ones that are not? The world's kind of your oyster there. Right. This is just some of the overall value of taking this approach. Right. And I want to get into a couple of examples here, unicorns and jerks, and this is how I'm going to wrap things up. So let's take an example. All right, so let's say that you have people that travel from your company and travel to a hostile country like China, and you're concerned that the hardware on your laptop might be modified. What are some of the things you could potentially do to mitigate that risk?
Give them a new laptop when they get back.
So give them a new laptop when they get back. All right, so that's what I like. So you could potentially just completely throw that laptop in the trash because it might be cheaper to shred the laptop and sell it on eBay and give a completely new one than it is to address the risk. What are some other things you could do? And just because you're afraid that somebody's going to modify the firmware, they're going to put in a covert listening device like a radio frequency device. So even if it's air gapped, they're going to be able to monitor transmissions from it from miles away. There's any number of things that you do from a hardware perspective. What are some other things you can do? Yes?
Set up with a travel laptop that doesn't necessarily have a corporate image on it, but it has what they need to get their job done, and then, do away with it when they come back. Kind of the same philosophy as shredding their laptop, but don't give them their laptop.
Right. So that's good too, because you're also reducing the risk while they're there, because it has access to less systems and less data. Okay. Think about it this way. So, what else is going to be different? Think outside the box about a laptop when it comes back if it's that hardware added to it. How do you detect that there's hardware that's been added to it?
Maybe weigh it before you left the lady or put an anti-tamper tank or part of soda so that you can tell if it's a
Right. Okay, so very good. Very easy to put the anti-tamper tape on the laptop. If somebody had to break the tape to get in and tamper the device, they better have that identical anti-tamper tape, or you will notice that something's wrong. You could weigh it. You could say that, well, if you weigh it once they put something in, took something out, but yeah, I mean, we can go down that path. You weigh it before, you weigh it after, and weigh it different. It's at least an indicator that you might want to open up and see what's inside it. Or just blindly say if it weighs different, I'm going to throw it in the trash. Right? It's all about how much risk you're willing to accept. You can also obviously open it up and look, but you have to know what you're looking for. So these are all very good things that you could do. So this is something I would recommend capturing in the risk register. I want to cover one last scenario from a jerk perspective. So a lot of organizations for Active Directory or whatever enterprise system you have for your enterprise accounts have a lockout capability, and it usually works something like this. If there's more than X failed login attempts against the account since the last successful login, over a 5-minute span, lock out the account for Z minutes, where Z is some amount between 1 minute and infinity, meaning that it never gets unlocked automatically. I hate that control. I hate that control for a couple of reasons. One, it's a relative a time when it was more likely that there would be online attacks against authentication systems, meaning against the authentication system itself, versus stealing the hashes and cracking them, pass the hash attacks, leveraging reuse of passwords by attacking one system and using that password against another system, doing phishing attacks, all the things that really have an environment. So what you've instead done is you built a way for denial system attacks against an account or against your entire environment. So it's pretty trivial in most organizations to write a single line script in PowerShell or something else that either wham bam locks up every single account, or locks out accounts randomly, or locks out the CEO's account right before he's going to give the annual report to all the investors, or something else would be very impactful. Or just decides I'm going to pick some random accounts, lock them out every once in a while, no one really ever even thinks that anything's happened. They just assume people are fat fingering their accounts, their passwords, or have devices that have cache credentials, and you have no idea. So what are some things that you could do to potentially mitigate that risk? What's the easiest thing you could do to mitigate the risk that accounts will get locked out because of that? Disable lockout. So I would argue you could disable lockout, and instead your compensating control could be monitoring for a large number of passwords and authentication attempts against a single account. The same password against many different accounts, or diagonal attacks from multiple or the same IP address, using combinations of usernames and passwords against your authentication system. You could also potentially just alert users that, wow, somebody just performed 1 million attempts against your account on the 1,000,001st attempt. You could alert the user and the manager and the saw that the login was successful. So there's a lot better ways to address this without causing the accounts to get locked out. At least that's my position. So in a way, this control is built in a way for your systems to stop producing widgets, for your salespeople to stop selling the widgets, and other bad things to happen in your environment. And if you start thinking about this in terms of these other uniform scenarios in your own, you probably realize you have a lot of scenarios in your environment that you don't have any controls for, and you haven't really talked about with your stakeholders. So I think I'm probably about out of time, or am I doing?
You're out.
I'm out of time. So I'm going to be around for another few hours if anyone wants to talk. I'll stick around here for a few minutes. I'm going to put these slides up on the slideshow in the next few hours, and hopefully I'll accomplish this. And this is how you can contact me if you want to reach me. One of the things I'm really excited about, and hope you'll take advantage of this, any of you have any jerk or unicorn scenarios that you'd like to share with me? I'm very interested in hearing about the scenarios you have, whether or not you actually have a mitigation plan for them or not, because I'm looking to address it and add those kind of things to my real life and my environment. So I'll take questions now.
One thing that I think goes along with this that wasn't really addressed was insider threat. Or if you have a terminated employee, it goes along with being able to lock that system down or take it out if needed. Because in some cases you cannot acquire that system in a timely fashion to take care of that, correct?
All right, absolutely. So I think that's one of the things that's important to build in from an architectural perspective is, if you want to limit the damage when somebody gains unauthorized access to a system or an account, whether it's an insider or not, what are the steps you would have to take? And just understand, what are your manual processes right now to do it, how long would it take, and to what degree you're comfortable. If you're not comfortable with it, and start thinking about ways to automate it. There's a presenter that's presenting, I think, the next talk, Evil Mob, that I think is going to talk about some of the ways that he addresses that in his environment. If he's not in his talk, he'd probably be willing to talk to you outside of his talk about some of the things he does. His organization does some very advanced things in terms of quickly removing access when the individual is separate from the organization.
But I think it's along the same selling point too, though. Not only can you do it if the laptop's stolen, but you also can do it if somebody that has access to that laptop is ready to take it away.
Exactly. Any other questions? Thoughts? So if I could ask if this was irrational, defensible, or necessary, does anyone think that this approach of looking at unicorns and jerks is irrational? You're not going to hurt my feelings if you say it's irrational. No one? What about defensible? Necessary? Necessary? Okay. Defensible? Alright, so I have quite a few necessaries and a few defensibles, so no irrationals. It's interesting to know. Well, I appreciate you guys spending the time with me here this afternoon, the last day of DerbyCon.